Thank you to the EU and to Brookings for the invitation to engage in this debate and discussion. I wanted to start with a lightning round, asking about the top threats facing Africa right now, as this is a discussion on the operational challenges in Africa. And I want to ask each of our panelists, what do you see the stability picture evolving to in about a year, with Africa facing the twin challenges of the COVID pandemic and rising, quickening climate change? Ms. Knopf, can we start with you?
Well, sure. Thank you, Kim, and thanks to the organizers for having me on. I would just suggest that with COVID-19, we're seeing the stresses and vulnerabilities on the continent being exacerbated and possibly accelerated. Already, we have an unprecedented number of forcibly displaced people on the continent. We're at 29 million people forcibly displaced. Some 72% of those are internally displaced, so they're within their own national borders. And of course, the vast majority of that entire population is somewhere on the continent. They're vulnerable from conflict, from repressive governance, from fragility that affects 34 of the 54 countries on the continent. We know we're in the bottom quartile of the Fragile States Index. So we'll be watching very closely to see how threats from violent extremist organizations, from ongoing conflict, from increased food insecurity and potential political instability unfold as we're just at the very beginning stages of the COVID crisis in Africa.
General Maio, with your long experience in Africa, what do you see as the security picture that you're planning for a year out from now, because of COVID and environmental change?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this forum. Yeah, I see a continent with a lot of countries, very fragile countries, hugely affected by this COVID-19 crisis. As you know, we have our 3 missions in Africa. In MPCC, we are responsible for the planning and conduct of those 3 missions. We were affected, but also the 3 countries with very fragile institutions suffering in terms of the health impact and also economic and social impact. We need to wait and see what will be really the security impact in those countries, and what we should do to support them to reform their security sector, and especially the defense sector, where we have a very important role with our missions in Mali, in Central African Republic, and in Somalia. So over to you.
So, General Ridzák, over to you. You are on the ground in Mali. I know you just got there, but what are you looking at within that country and that mission in terms of both COVID and environmental change?
Welcome. Thank you very much for also having a chance to participate in this discussion. Our mission, in fact, was already affected by COVID. We had to take a very prudent approach in March this year, and we had in total 10 positive cases. The people were evacuated from the theater, and we had to lock down and decrease the numbers of the personnel in the theater. During this initial phase, we developed internal directive which follow the overall guidance of World Health Organization and established the assessment criteria to watch the evolution of COVID propagation in Mali and in neighboring countries. We put immediately measures in place to prevent further spread. With that, the mission was quickly able to curb the spread of the virus. And since then, we are COVID-free. 2 months ago, We slowly restarted some of our activities with prudent measures in place, strictly followed on both sides, Malian and our. In the meantime, we managed to realize successfully our rotation of personnel as planned before COVID, following again all necessary precautions. We prepared to increase our training activities with current personnel under COVID environment and thus learn how to adapt to the new situation while gathering important lessons. And we can see that the local forces are following the same path. So we all have to adapt to the new life under COVID. Back to you. Thank you.
Before I go on to General Zana for his lightning round question, I just wanted to ask, General Ridzák, what does that mean in terms of taking measures? Does that mean everyone masks up, you're wearing gloves? Do the local forces have those kind of supplies? Or are you having to provide those kind of supplies? And is there any sort of resistance to taking those kind of measures in the field?
Yes, we abide by, as I mentioned before, the World Health Organization advice. So social distancing, wearing mask, temperature check every day. And as I can see my partners, because I'm very often participating in this environment together with Malians at the general staff level or other venues, I see that they are wearing masks as well, and they abide by the same regulations as we. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. General Zana, over to you. You're at the Pentagon in the J5, looking at these problems. How are you planning for the next year? What do you predict will happen?
Well, I actually think the way that you led into that, Kim, is very helpful because it's a wholesale change in the way that we go about planning and coordinating for the many activities that the Department of Defense and more broadly U.S. government does in partnership with many different partners, both regional nations and of course EU and NATO activities. So what we found is that all of the drivers of instability and all of the challenges that have always existed for us all are still there. And in some areas, we see worsening or greater challenges. Look no further than Libya or some of the things going on in the Sahel. When you superimpose the challenges of COVID, it changes many of the opportunities that we would have to be involved in exercises, partnership activities, many of the things that we do in security cooperation, and then many of the planning things that we do. How this manifests back in the building for the Pentagon and in and around DC, there are many processes that we normally have that are kind of attuned to a calendar. So whether that's things that are being done with regard to budgeting, planning exercises, the way that we'll sit down to talk through priorities for activities worldwide and on continent, all of those now get compressed in different ways because of what occurs with COVID. We're finding the rotation for forces for operational activities, particularly when we see areas like Camp Lemonnier and Djibouti and activities in Somalia, greater challenges with that. The cancellation of exercises or postponement of those things, it forces us to look at the whole problem set differently. And just briefly to that end, I think the Pentagon has had a significant pivot over the last couple of months to look at what are the most critical ways that we can get at working with partners to do the things that we're trying to do more efficiently and to do them in a way that we're not either overlapping or we're not creating new gaps and seams. Back over to you.
So practically speaking, what does that look like? Does that mean you are doing Zoom calls with your partners to do the by, with, and through training? I mean, is most of it happening at the headquarters level? So you're talking about strategy versus you're not really able to do a lot of on the ground training and focus on tactics?
Yeah. So there's some things operationally that just have to continue. So the workarounds that have been installed to be able to do those, to include quarantining people either stateside or on other continents before they go on the continent, or quarantining them once they're on continent. That's some of the things we've done with individuals and small units. The other is trying to just have creative solutions like this. I think we all now have 4 or 5 different applications that we do our video teleconferencing with. It's just a new way of doing work. Some of the big challenges we find in that, working through areas of classification, for example, we've had to figure out how to make the connective tissue work so that we can be agile in being able to have engagements and talk about sensitive timing for troop movements and things like that. The other is, everyone works at different speeds with this. So some African partners are well ahead of us in terms of what they do for video teleconferencing. Some are not. Same thing with all the rest of the partners with the EU. So it's us, I think, trying to get all of these gears to mesh in a way that works and allows us to continue to do the important work that needs to be done.
And a question for all of the military commanders. Does your choice of what mission to carry on with, is that dependent on which nation has the best testing capacity, which military is most compliant with WHO regulations? General Maio, how's that affecting your planning?
Thank you. So, in fact, I wanted to join others in their comments about the situation in the mission. So we at the EU, so we are in a situation now in our 3 UTMs in the reduction phase. So we were obliged to reduce our presence. It was necessary to suspend our training. And this is simple. So we as a training missions, we need to be in close contact with our trainees. So the training audiences should be in close relation with us. So it was necessary in a certain moment to suspend our training activities. And now we are preparing to resume all those activities. We had some COVID-19 situations in UTM Somalia and also in Mali, as Brigadier General František mentioned, and now we have the same problem in Central African Republic. How we did during this period, so we were active in support of the host nations, providing advice to the armed forces in those countries to prepare themselves to face the situation. And we continued with some training activities. In the case of Somalia, for example, with the remote support, so they are really able to receive our advice, our lessons through VTC, for example. In Central African Republic, we had a very good activity in support the high-level authorities, creating plans, interministerial plans to face the COVID-19 situation, and also supporting the CHODs and the armed forces in general to face this situation. And in Mali, we continue to perform some activities even now with the capacities remaining in the missions. We reduced more or less 50% our capacities, but we continue to have some essential means on the ground. And as I said, we are preparing ourselves to resume very soon our activities to become to the full capacity as it was before this COVID-19 crisis. What we intend to do is to do it gradually in a consensus-based. We are multinational missions, so we have to do it in a coordinated, in the orderly way. And this is what we are looking for, with all the member states contributing for those missions. One thing is sure for us, we need to continue in this non-permissive COVID-19 environment. So we need to adapt ourselves in order to guarantee our safety, our health safety, and also the safety of our counterparts, our audiences, our partners in those countries. Over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to move to broaden the aperture out to those missions. Ms. Knopf described a situation of a lot of internal displacement, a lot of sort of instability that your adversaries can take advantage of. The EU the EU strategy for Africa has a lot of lofty goals. It describes strengthening cooperation through partnerships in green transition, digital transformation, sustainable growth and jobs, peace and governance, migration and mobility. These are goals that I have heard articulated for the past few decades by several successive both European and US governments. You have a situation where now a pandemic is gripping that continent, and you have the quickening of climate change and the fallout of that. Are the same solutions that you've tried before, are they working? Ms. Knopf, I'd like to start with you. What's the best type of intervention that can bring stability from your perspective?
Well, I think we know from a lot of experience that stability and enduring end to conflict and to violence comes from daily safety and security for citizens, from having access to justice, and from having meaningful livelihoods. Of course, when we look at what COVID-19 and the pandemic, the further stress, the way it may accelerate or exacerbate the challenges to providing that security governance that must come from nations, from societies, from communities themselves. It's imperative that we continue to stay focused and engaged as the United States, as the EU, as NATO, together to provide support and assistance to African security sector partners in their efforts to strengthen their relationships with citizens, to navigate new tasks and roles that they're being given in the course of these lockdowns, to understand the importance of access for livelihoods, and really the critical challenge that food security will ever more be in the coming 12, 18 months as we see this pandemic unfold. And to stay focused on those core tasks of finding an enduring way to strengthen institutions, to deliver professional, apolitical security sector governance will be a key to then enabling political settlements to still come into fruition for the countries that are in conflict. 90% of the internally displaced on the continent come from 10 countries that are primarily challenged by internal conflicts. And so we have solutions. We have to stay focused on them. We have to understand the priority for Africa and the vulnerabilities that will be so exacerbated now by COVID-19. Over to you.
Sorry, apparently I'm muted. I hope I'm not. General Zana, if you can hear me, what is the adversary doing in the face of these challenges? Do you see growth in criminal militant activity?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Kimberly. I think, there's a number of different lenses that we look at adversary problem sets. And one of these, as we've led into the conversation, and I think that Kate really hit on, is there are all of these drivers of instability that are already there. So the context is already tremendously challenging. The lenses that we look through, whether it be a great or global power competition in issues like that, regional or border issues, or the threat of violent extremist groups, transnational organizations. One of our challenges has been to understand what response those organizations have had, what it is that they're doing or not doing when you add COVID into the broader context. So an example of one of the things that we've seen and monitored closely is within Somalia, and Al-Shabaab seeking to set up additional services and clinics. There's been some writing on that in the media. So while it hasn't been tremendously successful, it is an indicator of a broader set of ambitions that you see from a violent extremist group. The other, and we can't turn a broader blind eye in the discussion to what are in great or global power competition, what is going on there. So there was some discussion amongst the panelists previously about Libya. And I look at Libya, that probably a conflict that would command the front page of all of our key national newspapers and would consume a whole lot of energy with both media and government attention if it weren't for the backdrop of all of the other things going on. Yet it is going on, and you have the potential opportunists, and I look at with great concern, particularly for Russia's activities with Wagner Group and other paramilitaries or paramilitary organizations that have been brought in from other countries, that just adds fuel to the conflict. Those sorts of circumstances, I think, draw the most attention and most concern from the Department of Defense, because these things that are occurring in the near term can have tremendous impacts on longer term security and stability in some key areas. Back over to you.
Now, Russian intervention combined with China's intervention, especially in the form of its One Belt, One Road programs, its loans, some of the large projects that it's building that have, according to US officials, strings attached that can be pretty devastating for a local country. Let's pivot. How do you combat that? General Zana, since you brought it up, can you describe?
Sure, I'll lead in on that, and then I'll pass it back over to my fellow panelists. So, from the perspective of an African nation, and I look at this from a very realistic and pragmatic viewpoint. If you have an opportunity to have a project, some endeavor embarked upon, and it's the choice of having the project or not having the project, I understand that there are tremendous pressures to be able to do that, to build a road, a port, airfields, things like that. But it is one of those things that we always encourage to give pause at the underlying processes that get you there. If there are payoffs and there is graft and there are undermining of institutions for fair governance, democracies, or whatever the construct is for power and decision making within a given country, then those offers and those projects go with some strings attached. Having spent a year in Djibouti and being very close to Chinese counterparts, I recognize that China is doing some things with regard to peacekeeping operations on the continent, and I applaud China being a part of a broader set of solutions. But I also got to see firsthand the activities, whether it be activities that were low kinetic against U.S. and other forces, lasing of aircraft that are flying under Djiboutian airport control, things like that, which are not adhering to international norms and not setting an environment for safe operation for the many different foreign activities that are going on. Just one example in Djibouti. The other is seeing, as I travel about Eastern Africa, we would have engagements, and then I would see a very large Chinese delegation, a whole of government delegation coming in for different engagements on a scale that was hard for me to comprehend, seeing it through kind of a Western lens. We would have a meeting with 4 or 5 U.S. international partners, and then seeing a bus with 25 or 30 representatives of military, government, just all of the players from China, and just continually going back to our African partners and encouraging them to help set conditions that offers fair opportunities for competition, for business, and for diplomatic engagement from the rest of the world. Back over to you.
Thanks. General Maio, how has it complicated your mission?
Our missions in Africa are similar. So our mandates are related with the defense sector reform. So we are there to support those nations to reconstruct their military capabilities. And the EU has a capacity, a very special capacity to work in different areas. We need to understand that the problems in those countries are more related with state building realities than to the purely security and defense realities. And we need to be balanced in our approach. So we need to develop the military instruments, so the reform the defense sector, but at the same time—
But sorry to interrupt, but doesn't Russian and Chinese monetary and defense interference, does it complicate your mission? And if so, how do you convince your local partners to go with the EU's point of view as opposed to with a country that might be offering them much cheaper terms on a loan for a defense project?
Yes, you are right. So we saw in some cases, specifically in Central African Republic, and I had this experience with the Russians coming with an opportunistic intervention and taking, let's say, some activities with no regulation, so with no transparency. What we want when we are in those countries is transparency between all the actors in support of those countries, not taking opportunities and of course with a huge impact later. Brigadier General William Zana talked about, for example, investments projects. I think there is a very important role regulating those investments also. We cannot accept seeing this with no transparency and seeing those countries prisoners of some let's say dark rules, not very well known by everyone. So in my perspective, as usual, in those countries, we need to balance development, of course, with the security. This is a very important task, and I think European Union is able to do it because we have different instruments and the so-called integrated approach using all the capacities of the EU and also cooperation with our partners. So of course, the transatlantic cooperation is very important in this domain. And I witnessed in Central African Republic, for example, how it is important to cooperate with the United States. And we did it with the State Department and also the United States Embassy in Bangui. And we had a very good cooperation. So there is room to improve our action in transparency in support of those nations. Over to you.
Thank you. And I realize it's also a bit of an unfair question to put to military commanders because it is something that political leaders need to try to figure out how to intercede. But it's interesting to hear that it does complicate your mission, Russian and Chinese activities on the continent. I'd like to move to a question from the audience, from Pearl Matibe, a journalist from Zimbabwe, who would like us to expand on issues raised by the German defense minister earlier today, that you have terror threats and a migrant issue exacerbated by the stability situation that affect EU security interests. That leads into the question of the Libya mission. The EU has announced a mission to try to bring stability to Libya, which is one of the main places that some of these threats are emanating from right now because of proximity. But it is a offshore mission. From my reading of it, there are very little boots on the ground. How is that going to solve the situation there? Okay, I guess General Maio, that's over to you again.
Yes, we need to understand the mandates of our missions. Yes, you are right. So the Irini is a mission with a specific mandate. And first, the objective is to implement the United Nations arms embargo on Libya, but this mission has also a capacity building and training capacity to train the Libyan Coast Guard and the Navy. About troops on the ground, I think this is a very political issue. It is difficult, of course, for me, but I think at the EU institutions, we are looking for the situation on the ground, and for sure, considering the fact that the stability in Libya will have a very important and positive impact also towards the security in the continent, in the Sahel, and of course in general in Africa, and certainly in Europe. I'm sure that Europe will look at this with a lot of attention. I would say that migration is related with the fact that our African friends, they don't have the conditions to even live in Africa, and there are also security problems. So I back again to the question of development. So we need really to solve the immediate problems we have, and those are related, of course, with the security, but we need to invest in the future, changing mentalities and trying to support the development of those countries, because the Africans, they love Africa, and they all like to live in Africa. This is my point. Over to you.
Thank you. I have a question from Konstantin Atlamazoglu from the Fletcher School. Regarding the Sahel situation, how can the European allies ensure that recent military successes against AQIM aren't undermined by the political realities of the G5? General Ridzák, would you like to take that? I bet he's going to hand it to you, General Maio.
Yeah. I would appreciate I would appreciate to leave it to General Maio.
Okay. Well, while we have you, can I ask, in terms of what does boots on the ground training get you in terms of increasing the skills and capability of the force you're working with, and how long is it going to take? I have heard U.S. military commanders complain about U.S. Special Operations Forces, saying they just want to keep training them, but the moment we leave, the capability falls apart.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it's true. It's the fact that European Mali now received a new mandate from May this year for upcoming 4 years. And it's the first time then we received a 4-year mandate. It was always for 2 years. So it reflects the situation. What I can see is as important fact is that in the current security environment, the continued international presence in Mali, including MINUSMA, Barkhane, G5 Sahel joint force, and EUTM is extremely important. The EUTM overall objective is to assist to Malian forces in building their autonomous operational capabilities, and through various projects to contribute to the military capabilities development, as it was mentioned already. And we have to understand that this is a long-term process. We advise at the strategic ministerial level to allow Malians to manage their forces in a sustainable way. We have already provided advice at the level of the General Staff and land and ground forces to establish the right procedures and management systems.
If I may interrupt, since we have only a little bit of time left, it sounds like what you're saying is that the EU has committed to this for at least the near term, but we've had US insurgency specialists say it can take up to 50 years to really fight an insurgency and build a capable force. Would you like to have that long, if you could, to train?
It's really a difficult, very difficult question. I know all this experience the military had so far in their engagements, but we have to be here and we have to assist a country or countries which are in the current status, as everybody is watching closely. So we cannot leave it as it is, because it would have, in my view, an impact on us all. So that's the only thing that we should be patient. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you. General Maio, the question about the Sahel.
Yes, thank you. Just in support of General Ridzák, yes, our intervention is not a short-term intervention, so this is a long-term. And I want to stress really that we need to change mentalities. And this takes time. This is very important. Mentalities in our military counterparts. Education is a very important domain and will not solve this problem immediately. So we are acting at different levels, and we need to complement our actions. And the EU intervention is a long-term intervention. About the question raised related with the J5 Sahel, what I can say is that we are investing and improving the capacities of J5 Sahel Joint Force. The new headquarters was inaugurated some days ago, and we as UTM are investing on it. And I think we can expect really an improvement in their capacities. What I want to stress also is that the J5 Sahel is a regional organization. We need really to coordinate regionally, but we need to act locally. And this is what we are doing with UTM. With the new mandate UTM, we will be refocused in the center of Mali. And we also start to provide better training capacities to the J5 Sahel Joint Forces, and also supporting the J5 Sahel countries, so training their armed forces. We are preparing ourselves to start one of our important activities in the near future in Burkina Faso. So, and we have good indicators from the member states. We had a Global Force Generation conference some weeks ago, and the commitments are there. So I think we will improve those capacities. And I don't see the J5 Sahel jeopardizing the good results we are having in those more kinetic activities on the ground.
So watch this space. Last question to General Zana. One of the things I frequently hear when I talk to European officials and African officials is the Trump administration has given very mixed signals on its commitment to Africa. Is that valid? And if not, how do you convince people that the US is going to be there for the mission long term?
So thank you for asking me a question about the Trump administration. And I have to keep my DOD hat on. So I think it's a fair question, because I do have these discussions with all of my counterparts, both African nations and EU partners in particular. So the thing to keep in mind is that the US commitment in Africa continues, and it's been a deep legacy of commitment that has been focused on helping African nations to come up with solutions to the many challenges they have, and to be a part of international organizations. The defense piece of that, the security, is a supporting effort to diplomacy, to development, to all of those other capabilities. And I think one of our challenges is always getting that integration of how do we best move the ball forward in any given country, and it's a different solution set for each. The bigger piece for the department, though, AFRICOM and the Department of Defense remain absolutely committed to both the commitments that we've made and the commitments that we'll continue to make in partnership. Processes that we've gone through that over the last 6 months of doing assessments of, and this is going across all the combatant commands, are reasonable things to assess: are we doing things right? Do we have the right forces and the right capabilities in the right regions? Are we partnering in putting the resources that are most critical at the right place and time? Periodic reassessment of that is healthy and is something that is prudent. There are always going to be greater demands than there are the ability to meet all of those demands. So I think the prioritization, and then working with our allies and partners to figure out how we best complement those efforts, I think that's the key going forward.
Thank you, General. And I'd like to ask my last question in the minute I have left to Ms. Knopf, if you could take us home with a short answer on, should NATO have a greater role in Africa?
Well, I think the West definitely needs to continue to stay engaged, and NATO, the European Union, the United States, it's imperative that we continue to support an apolitical, professional military and security sector across the continent with like-minded African governments. This is key to the question you asked on stability and on dealing with these stressors and challenges, the ones that we know from climate, from structural challenges already with demography, et cetera, the new ones layered on because of the global health pandemic going forward. Africa will be a quarter of the world's population by 2050, and it's imperative for all of our security and prosperity that Africa succeed and thrive. And so absolutely NATO should remain and increase engagement to be the longstanding, enduring partner for African nations and peoples. Thank you.
With that, I say thank you to all of the panelists today, to the Brookings Institute, and I pass back to the EU for the next event.